Obama is running up trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars in new debt, wherein the Obama regime is actively trying to mathematically collapse the United States. And I firmly believe that they've done it. They've reached critical mass. It can't be walked back now.
This video is brought to you by Reluctant Preppers. Click here to subscribe for free to reluctantpreppers.com. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with financeandliberty.com. You are listening to a Finance and Liberty interview, and our guest today is Ann Barnhardt from the former Barnhardt Capital Management. Thank you so much for joining us, Ann.
Oh, thanks, Elijah. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you. I appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciate it too. And since we haven't had you on before, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I guess first, can you tell us a little bit about your Barnhardt Capital Management and why you shut it down? I know in a video you made, you said, it doesn't matter how honest your brokers, wealth managers, or local bankers are, the problem is systemic, and it will touch every person on earth. And I know you shut down your brokerage because even though your clients knew that you were honest, the problem was you weren't the one who could protect their money. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. Barnhardt Capital Management was what was called an independent introducing brokerage, which means that I wasn't actually the custodian of my customers' funds. And understand who my customer base was. My customers were farmers and ranchers. I was a true commercial hedge broker. I was doing livestock and grain risk management with farmers and ranchers, meaning that my clients actually owned and possessed the physical commodity. They actually owned and possessed the physical cattle and the physical grain, and they were using the futures and options market in order to lay off risk and literally forward contract their cattle and grain production and needs. And so I, as an independent introducing broker, all I was doing was I was introducing them to an FCM. An FCM stands for Futures Commission Merchant. Those are the big clearing houses in Chicago and New York. Of course, all of my business being agricultural was in Chicago. And so I wasn't actually the custodian, the legal custodian of my customers' money. I was just introducing them to whoever I was clearing through. And at the time of my shutdown, I was clearing through Penson, Penson. And as a lot of your listeners might know, Penson failed in mid 2000. Let me get my years straight. Mid 2012. The guy who was running Penson had evidently made some absolutely ludicrous $45 million bet on some horse track out in the middle of Texas. And as soon as I got wind of this and started watching the bond yields on the company, I knew that it was just a matter of time before Penson went under. But that's not actually what precipitated the closing of my commodities firm. Of course, the closing of my brokerage was precipitated by MF Global and John Corzine just outright stealing $1.6 billion with a B, billion dollars in segregated customer funds. It was an unprecedented event, completely unprecedented. And it wasn't just the fact that John Corzine stole the $1.6 billion in segregated customer funds. The thing that truly led me to shut down my brokerage 2 weeks later was the fact that the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, whose entire function and purpose it is to stand in the middle of all futures and options transactions and be the de facto counterparty and the guarantor so that client A doesn't need to worry about the creditworthiness of client B on the other side. So what that means, and what this has meant all throughout the history of the Mercantile Exchange and the Board of Trade in Chicago, is that whenever a firm has failed and gone under, and it's happened many, many times before, the exchange has always stepped in and guaranteed all of the contracts, guaranteed everything that was going on, and in fact, even bought out, in essence, the failed commodities firms, and then, turned around and taken responsibility for reparsing out those assets, selling them, basically, as it were. Now, the day that MF Global failed, in total, the company was worth a little bit over 6 billion, with a B, 6 billion. The stolen customer funds were about, we now know, 1.6 billion, with a B. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and Terry Duffy, who is the CEO of the Merc, he was sitting on an emergency slush fund of over $8 billion. Okay, so the Merc, on the day that MF Global failed, could have completely bought out the company, guaranteed and backstopped everyone and everything without even breaking a sweat, and still had about $2 billion left over in its emergency slush fund. The fact that Terry Duffy and the Mercantile Exchange elected not only to not do that, but to lock those customers out of their accounts for in excess of a week, not even allowing them to liquidate their positions. This is just completely unfathomable, Elijah. And even though I wasn't clearing through MF Global, I saw the writing on the wall, and what instantly became obvious to me, and then connecting that to the fact that I knew what was going on with my clearing firm, which was Penson, and how they were kind of on the ropes financially anyway. What I took from the MF Global collapse was that Terry Duffy and the rest of the Mercantile Exchange elected not to execute their fiduciary duty as the clearing firm, elected not to step in and backstop MF Global, and the question is why? Why didn't they do it? The answer is because they knew that all of the other futures commissions merchants were doing exactly the same thing as what John Corzine was doing, perhaps not as heavily leveraged, because remember, John Corzine is a complete psychopath. The man is just, he has absolutely no internal conscience or any sense of risk control at all. So yeah, he had MF Global leveraged to an absolutely unfathomable level. But the fact of the matter is, Elijah, is that Terry Duffy knew that all of the other FCMs were doing exactly the same thing that John Corzine was doing, which is to say that they were taking customer money, customer segregated funds. And because we are in a zero interest rate environment and they cannot make any money off of buying US T-bills, that they have to take that money and leverage it into these uber risky investments. And what Corzine was doing was he was using the customer money to invest in high risk European sovereign debt paper through repos and credit default swaps. But let's be honest, the rest of the FCMs are doing exactly the same thing, although perhaps not to the leverage ratio that Corzine was doing it. So why I shut down my firm is because as soon as I figured this out and realized that the Merc would never do anything to backstop any other failed FCM, I knew that I couldn't backstop my customers' accounts. At the peak of my business, and please understand what I was just a one-man introducing brokerage handling livestock and grain commercial hedge clients. At the peak of my business, I was about a $3.5 million office. I didn't have $3.5 million on hand to backstop my clients. And so therefore, it became morally incumbent upon me to notify every single one of them that, look, this is no longer tenable. I cannot guarantee the safety of your funds. It's over. We need to get out of this. I'm shutting down, and you need to get out of the markets too. So that's the 5 minute version of the backstory.
I know that you've said if wealth is just on a computer screen, it can be confiscated instantly. And I know that's what we saw. You mentioned MF Global, but that's also what we saw in Cyprus. What's your take on that?
Well, exactly. Cyprus is just the next step after MF Global. MF Global was a private business entity, and so I truly believe that MF Global was the test case. I think that they did MF Global and Corzine in collusion with the Obama regime because he's up to his eyeballs in the Obama regime. Corzine was widely understood to be Timmy Geithner's replacement as Treasury Secretary. If the MF Global thing hadn't happened, in fact, they even had this written into the MF Global bonds that if Corzine was named Treasury Secretary, that I believe there was a 100 basis point increase in the payout on the MF Global bonds if that happened. So understand, Corzine was one of Obama's top boys, and there's all kinds of videos of Joe Biden on YouTube saying, hey, if I ever have a question about the financial markets, literally the first call I make is to John Corzine. Well, of course it is, Joe Biden, because you're a slack-jawed, drooling imbecile. Of course you would call John Corzine, who is a psychopath and who is also, let's be honest, a slack-jawed imbecile. The only reason that John Corzine was elevated up to the top of Goldman Sachs and then, hired onto MF Global is because the man is a psychopath. These people are specifically recruiting psychopaths. So back to your original question. Yes, MF Global was the test run. It was the test run to see, all right, what will happen if we just flat out steal $1.6 billion in customer money, and not just quote unquote customers. Let's steal it from a bunch of farmers and ranchers. And let's just see what happens. And we all saw what the result is. Nothing, basically nothing. These people, I mean, the men in this culture, and I've said this forever and ever, have been completely castrated and will just roll over. They've just given up. So someone can come along and someone can just completely financially rape you, and you'll just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about this. And what a lot of people don't understand is they see these stories about the MF Global settlement and how, well, they're up now to 89% payout recovery on the MF Global accounts. What your listeners and what everybody needs to understand is that almost all of the farmers and ranchers were so hamstrung by the confiscation of their operating capital, which was sitting in their hedge accounts, that most of those people sold out to what I refer to as recovery sharks, meaning people who came along and said, hey, I will buy out your claim on your MF Global account right now, and I'll pay you 40 cents on the dollar for it. A lot of my farmer and rancher people were so hamstrung in terms of cash flow by having their commodity account completely stolen that in order to stay in business, they had no choice but to sell out their claims to these recovery sharks for, tops 40 cents on the dollar. So when you read these stories saying that, hey, the MF Global payout is all the way back up to 89 cents on the dollar, understand that the most vulnerable people, the farmers and ranchers, almost none of them are left. Almost none of them are left holding an MF Global claim because they had to sell out early on to keep from going bankrupt. That's an incredibly important point that I think is lost on a lot of people.
I know that you've said before that nobody really understands the current state of our economy right now, how dire the situation is. And you're talking about the Cyprus situation, the MF Global situation. Should people be worried about their money? And if there was one thing you had to tell them to do with their money right now, how can they keep their money safe?
Oh, no question at all. And back to your question about Cyprus. Cyprus is just MF Global, but on a national sovereign level. It is absolutely guaranteed to be coming to the United States. First, it will get into the rest of Europe, and I've heard, through the grapevine that Eastern Europe, Slovakia, that kind of thing. That's who's next in terms of having the Cyprus maneuver done on them. All bank accounts are now fair game. People in the EU are now openly saying that bank confiscations will be required and will be executed in order to bail out the European banking system, which is an unsalvageable disaster. It is mathematically unsalvageable. And where this business of confiscation will first hit the United States is absolutely in terms of retirement accounts, and then it will eventually get into bank accounts. And I've been talking about this for a good long time. Carl Denninger has been talking about this for a long time, and Warren Pollock has been talking about this for a long time. That if you just simply sit down and look at the mathematics of the banking situation, of the global financial system, and the financial system in the United States, you come to no other conclusion than the necessity for bank holidays and the sweeping of demand deposit accounts. And again, this is a point that I've made many, many times, but if I can touch one more person with this explanation, I'll do it. And that is, well, Anne, I don't have to worry about that because my bank is FDIC insured. Okay, stop and think about this. If the entire banking system collapses, even if just a quarter of the banking system collapses, remember the banking system in the United States is, it oscillates between eight, let's call it 8 and 10 trillion in demand deposits. Okay. If a quarter of that fails, which it very easily could, because the top tier, the top 5 or 6 banks in the United States in terms of demand deposits are carrying in excess of 100 trillion in derivatives exposure. If the top 5 or 6 banks in the US fail, how in the world is the FDIC going to pay out on that? You've got a banking system with, let's call it, around 10 trillion in demand deposits. And the last number I saw for the FDIC, and it might be a little bit higher than the last one I saw, but the last number I saw for the FDIC was that they had 11 billion. Okay, so the demand deposits are 10 trillion with a T. The FDIC only has a pool of 11 billion with a B. Okay, this makes no sense. You're not going to get anything. It's going to be just like Cyprus. It's going to be exactly like Cyprus, and they're going to say, okay, you're going to get X% of your demand deposit account frozen, then swept. And if you don't like it, that's just tough. And I would also throw in that we've just seen within the last week, what is Argentina doing? And ladies and gentlemen, keep a close eye on Argentina, because Argentina is basically the forerunner of everything that is happening. It's almost like the global Marxist regime is looking at Argentina as the template for the series of events that can be carried out. What has Argentina declared just within the last week? Either you buy Argentinian bonds, or we will come after you and we will put you in prison. I mean, that's where all of this is eventually leading. There's also this business of forcing people to convert bank deposits into bonds, going out in other locales in Europe as well. And eventually it will come to the United States, because as bad as all of these European and South American sovereign nations are, let's not kid ourselves. Mathematically speaking, the worst country is the United States. What's the difference? Here's the analogy I make. The United States, because it is by far the largest economy on the planet, is like a 747 cruising along at 42,000 feet at 600 miles an hour. If all four of the engines simultaneously cut out, the glide ratio on that 747 is a tremendous distance. So it's going to be able to glide for a long way. But if it doesn't make it to an airport, it is going to crash and burn, and everybody is going to die. Whereas these smaller countries in Europe, take a Cyprus, for example. Well, goodness, a Cyprus, if we're going to make an airplane analogy, is just like a little bitty Piper flying around, you know? If all the engines cut, you could conceivably land a Piper in a cornfield somewhere. You can't land a 747 in a cornfield somewhere. Either you make it to the airport, you take drastic evasive measures, and you have an awesome total stud pilot who can get you into an airport and land the thing, or everyone's going to die. And the question I would ask you now is, do you honestly believe that right now we have an uber competent, totally awesome pilot behind the wheel of the plane who A, acknowledges that all four of the engines are out, and B, is actually trying to steer us towards a runway that we can land on? The answer to both of those questions is no. We have the equivalent of a mentally defective baboon behind the wheel of the plane. And by that, I mean national level United States governance, not only in the executive branch, but also in the Congress. These people are not only all universally psychopaths, but they are all universally slack-jawed, mouth-breathing imbeciles. If you have any confidence whatsoever that these people can proverbially land this 747, you are out of your mind. So what do you do to defend yourself against this? Withdraw from the system, get as much of your money out of the financial system as you possibly can, hold some of it in cash, because the US dollar will persist as being a unit of value for some period of time. But even though I am not a metals bug by any means, when you are in an emergency situation and you are looking at sovereign collapses, yes, metals absolutely are the place to be. Gold and silver diversified.
All right, and I wanted to move now to this topic of, the U.S. collapsing, as you're saying, and you've said that nothing can stop the economy from collapsing. Quote, when the U.S. rates uptick, the last vestiges of the now dead republic will implode. So do you see when this imploding of the United States economy happens, you're saying it'll just take down the whole financial system of the world, are you saying?
Absolutely, yes. Obama is running up trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars in new debt. The most conservative figure is something like 1.2 trillion in new debt per year. The truth is it's more than that, because that figure actually isn't counting the new debt being incurred by Social Security and Medicare. So now understand, okay, Obama since 2009, and then George W. Bush before him was running up large amounts of debt, but Obama has just taken it to this completely mathematically untenable, basically Cloward and Piven strategy level, wherein the Obama regime is actively trying to mathematically collapse the United States. And I firmly believe that they've done it. They've reached critical mass. It can't be walked back now. But understand, let's just call it from the beginning of the Obama regime in 2009. Okay, fine. He's running up $1 trillion in new debt per year, and that debt is being issued, in treasury paper via money, US dollars being just arbitrarily printed out of thin air by the Federal Reserve, and that treasury paper is being issued at what is basically 0%. 90-day T-bill rates just a few years ago were hovering around 5%. They've now been at zero since the beginning of the Obama regime. So you're issuing $1 trillion a year at minimum in new debt, and you're doing it at 0%. Okay, what happens when you take that debt that you have issued and you uptick the interest rates just a little bit, and just to, let's say that treasury paper rates uptick to 3%, which historically is extremely low in an historical context. I mean, 5% was even considered to be historically very low for treasury paper. If you just go from 0% to 3% interest on this debt, you add so much of a debt burden to the budget of the United States per year that it will eat up everything else and will completely collapse the system. But again, reiterating, this was all done intentionally. It's called the Cloward and Piven strategy. Cloward and Francis Fox Piven were professors at Columbia University during the 60s and 70s and perhaps into the 80s. And they taught this cadre of these neo-Stalinists, of whom the front man, of whom the puppet is this guy who is purportedly named Barack Obama. They taught them that the only way that you can destroy the quote unquote evil United States and establish a global totalitarian regime is that you have to collapse the United States from the inside out, primarily economically. And the way you do that is by overloading the federal government with all of these entitlements and all of this debt, and then collapse the entire thing from the inside out. You can't attack it from the outside because the United States was formerly too strong to be attacked militarily from the outside. The way to bring the United States down, and make no mistake, that is the objective of these people. They are traitors. They are seditionists. They are revolutionaries. They are looking to collapse the entire system and have already mathematically accomplished it. Is do it from the inside by mathematically overloading the debt load. And that will destroy the US dollar, which will then allow a new, probably global currency backed by the Russians, the Chinese, perhaps the BRIC nations, which would be what? Brazil, Russia, India, China, BRIC. To get them to establish a new currency with perhaps some involvement with the Middle East as well. And if you destroy the US dollar, you basically destroy the United States.
So before we let you go, can you just lay out for our viewers where you see this all going? I mean, what is the end game of all this?
I wish I could end on a better note with you, Elijah, but it's not good at all. I see a total systemic collapse of the United States. I see a total systemic collapse of the US dollar and the financial system, which is why I urge everybody to get out, get out, get out. And if you don't understand what get out means, then there's nothing I can do to help you. I can't tell you how many emails I get per day from people saying, well, I heard you on your interview and I read everything you write, but when you say get out, what exactly do you mean? You don't mean my Fidelity IRA, do you? Okay, if you're so obtuse and you are so thick-headed that you cannot understand what get out means, I can't help you. And there are people who email me and say things like, well, I can't get out of my 401k because then I'd have to pay X number of dollars in terms of tax liability. And then, well, I can't do that. I'm not going to pay taxes. I'm just going to sit and hold on to it. Okay, you're going to all of it stolen. What would you rather do? Would you rather pay your tax bracket in taxes or have 100% of it stolen? And what I would even say beyond that is, what is the matter with you? Why are you even still paying taxes? At this point, paying taxes is like paying taxes into the Third Reich. Really? You're a German in 1941 and you have a conscience and you have a brain in your head. Why are you paying taxes to Hitler? That's exactly what's going on here. A mass federal tax strike would go a long way to correcting all of this. But of course, people are so chicken and so terrified of the IRS. Oh no, we can't do that. And of course, Elijah, what are the headlines of the last week? The IRS has been coming after people and maliciously auditing people based upon their politics anyway. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? How are you going to fix this? How are you going to correct this political system? If you refuse to do anything on the offensive tactical side, if all you're willing to do is cower and hide and play prevent defense, how are you going to fix any of this? You have to go on offense. You have to fix your bayonet and you have to charge. You have to be proactive. Do what I did. Declare a federal tax strike. If enough people do that, maybe the government would get the message if tens of millions of Americans just didn't file. You really, IRS? You want to come audit all of us? You bring it. We're not paying for this anymore. You're paying for a cult of child sacrifice. You are paying for a cult of the ratification of sodomy, and you are paying to arm Mohammedans who are coming to kill you. How in the world can you justify this anymore? A federal tax strike would go a long way. So my 4-point plan is media strike, cancel your cable and satellite. B, tax strike. C, eventually it will come to the fact that we should be doing general strikes, which means a total work stoppage. You don't go to point C until you've done the first two, because point C, a general strike, actually harms the businesses of your neighbors. But as we saw with solidarity in Poland, general strikes do have a place and they do eventually need to be utilized. And then once you've done points A, B, and C, if those don't work, that's when we go to armed counter-revolution. And remember, we are not revolutionaries. Revolution means turning away from God. That is what the Obama regime is. That's what Marxism is. It's a rejection and a turning away from God. We want to turn back to God. We want to be a godly, moral society with the rule of law. That means that we are counter-revolutionaries. So never call yourself a revolutionary. You're always a counter-revolutionary, wanting to turn back towards God.
And Barnhardt, people can find you at barnhardt.biz. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Elijah. I appreciate the time.
This video was brought to you by ReluctantPreppers.com. Click here to hear the latest report from a prepping father who moved his family of 12 from the city to the nearby countryside and tells how he's raising meat for his family and rediscovered a shocking wild meat source too. Click here to subscribe for free to FinanceAndLiberty.com and also our sponsor, ReluctantPreppers.com, helping you be aware and prepared.